Welcome in this video about castling, and here we are going to see one of the most important rules in chess. And please open up your notebook, write down the day that you are watching this video, and please start writing that. Number 1. Change position with king and rook. This is the castling. We will change the position simultaneously with these two pieces. I'll show you exactly how to do that. After that, castling is a king's move. This is very important, and for that reason, if you would like to castling, then you should capture your king first, and after that the rook. Then the king is moving two steps towards to the rook. This is another important rule, and if I'm going very fast, of course you can pause the video and try to write down everything very clearly, and I'm suggesting to write things down in order to remember them more specifically and more correctly. It will be easier for you to remember. And last but not least, number 4. Castling is the only move in chess that we are moving two pieces simultaneously. Now let's go to the chessboard. We have a position here. I remove all other pieces in order to be very clear to you. We have the king, the white king, and two rooks in their initial positions. And here, in order to castling, I'll grab my king. I'll move it 2 squares toward to the h1 rook, from e1 to g1 square. After that, I will leave the king, and then I will capture the rook from h1 and put it on f1 squares. And now it's a program and it will make it automatically, of course, but you see I capture the king, I put it on g1, then I'll capture the rook and put it on f1. And I can do the same thing from the other side of the board. I can grab the king again, I'll move it 2 squares on d1 and c1, I'll leave it down, and then I'll grab the rook and put it on d1, and this is the long castling. What is the difference here? If I make the short castling, you will see that the rook moved only 2 squares, and from the other side of the board the rook moved 3 squares. For that reason we have the short and the long castling. So let's move forward. Why we are doing the castling? We are doing it in order to protect our king, and this is castle sword. You can see here that we have the pawns protecting the king, we have the rook, and it's very difficult for the opponent to attack our king. Imagine Putin, for example, the president of Russia, to go somewhere, and you can imagine that a lot of people are protecting him, they are around him. Something like that is the king. It's like a very important person that we should protect it, and we can make the castling from the other side of the board. We need a little more moves in order to do that. I'll explain you why, but here you can see again that the pawns are protecting the king. The rook is a little more active here because it's immediately in the game. Nonetheless, you can see that this diagonal h1 c1 is opened, and perhaps the enemy can give a check from this diagonal or attack our king. This is little difference about short and big castling. At the beginning I suggest you to castling short, because in this way it's easier for you and you will protect the king more efficiently. Now let's going to see when we can castling and when we cannot, and we have some restrictions. There are 6 restrictions. First of all, we should not have any piece between king and rook, neither black or white. I'll explain you exactly what I mean by examples. The second one is the king had moved. If we move the king for some reason to 1 square from e1 to f2, for example, and then we put it back on e1, then we cannot castling. It's not allowed it. If we move a rook, for example, and we go somewhere with a rook, then we cannot castle from this side. I'll explain it with examples. The other thing, the number 4, is that the king is in check. If the opponent attacked our king, then we cannot castling. We don't allow to perform the castling if our king is in check. And check, by check I mean if the opponent attack our king, if put a piece and in this beam of action is our king. The number 5 is that the passing rook, when we move forward with the king, we will go through some squares, and if an enemy piece protect these squares, then we cannot castling. And last but not least, if the enemy protect the final square that the king will end up, then we cannot castling. But let's go here and see it. We have the initial position here with from white pieces. I removed all the pawns, and in order to castling we need to remove the pieces. So I'll play a move like knight f3, then I'll play the bishop out, and now you can see that we can castling short, right? And if we go back, we removed only 2 pieces, and for that reason castling short side is easier and faster. If go to the other side, I'll remove the knight on knight c3, and after that I'll play bishop f4, king e8 for example, queen d2, king e7, and now I'll castling long side. I'll grab my king, I'll put it 2 squares toward to the rook, and after that I'll place it down, and then I'll grab the rook and put it on d1. Okay, this is short and long castling. In the next example you can see that we should not have pieces between the castling, neither on white or black pieces, and here white king cannot castling short or long because I cannot capture the knight and castling. I should capture the knight, you see, but after that imagine then that black king will move, then I will go back. And now if the king move again, I moved my king. For that reason I cannot castling short side now because my king was moved. And now in this particular example we can see that sorry, white king cannot castling short side or long side because here there are pieces, and we should remove them or do something else. The next thing is that our king is in check. What means in check? We can see here that the bishop is attacking, would like to capture, he is threatening the king. For that reason I cannot make short or long castling because my king is in check, and we will see a little later that I can move my king. This is a very natural defense, or I can put it on f1. Both of these moves are okay. Now we can see that the rook is attacking the king, so I cannot castling. Now we can attack the king with the queen, the knight, and let's go forward. In order to castling, I'll pass through f1 square in order to end up on g1. I'll grab my king. I'm trying to go on g1, but I cannot do it because this square, this f1 square, is protecting by the bishop. For that reason I cannot castling short, because the f1 square, the root, is protecting by an enemy piece. Nonetheless I can make the long castling because no one is protecting or attacking these squares. For that reason I can move my long castling, I can make my long castling like that very easily. Let's move forward. Now we can see that the bishop is from the other side of the board, and now I cannot perform the long castling because the d1 square is protecting by the bishop. For that reason I cannot castling long. However, I can castle short, there is no problem. And here I'd like to explain another thing, because many people don't understand it very easily. For example, let's say that the bishop is not there, but the bishop is on c5, for example. If I make this position, this bishop is protecting the b1 square. The rook will pass through b1, but not the king. In this particular position, I can perform either short or long castling very easily. For example, I'll put this position on the board. You can see that I can castle short and I can castle long normally, because it doesn't matter that the rook will pass this square. It's important that the enemy will not attack or protect or aim this square, f1 and d1. These are the important squares. So let's go back here, and you can see that the rook is playing this role now. He's controlling the f1 square, so we cannot castling short. And here you can see that the queen is much more powerful, and here in this position black's queen is protecting the f1 square and d1 squares. For that reason the king cannot castling on king's side or on queen's side. He cannot do anything about that, and for that reason he should play something else. But the queen stop this the white king to short or long castling. This is very rare situation, but it could happen, and it's good to know. This is another extremely scenario that the knight is protecting these two squares and we cannot castling. And let's move forward. If the enemy controls the square that the king will end up, we cannot castling sword. For example, here I cannot castling sword because the king will end up on g1, and this square is attacking by the bishop from c5 in this diagonal, and for that reason I cannot perform the short castling. However, I can make the long castling. It's okay because now no one is attacking my king or rook. Here you can see another example that the rook is protecting this the final square, and for that reason we cannot make the short castling, but we can perform the long castling if we like. And the next one, you can see that the queen is very powerful, and simultaneously she can protect the c1 square and g1 square. And in this particular position we cannot perform the short castle or the long castle because the queen is protecting these very important squares. And here you can see that the knight is protecting g1, and here's another example. I mentioned if for example the rook captures here and the knight, then the king will move, I will go back, for example on h1, the king will move again, and here I moved the rook. For that reason I cannot castling short. Okay, this is important to remember. However, I can castling long side if I like, because I didn't move any of these two pieces. So this was important. And move forward. Here I have a very popular example. This was, I'm not going to provide this game from the beginning, but here is the important thing, that the king is in attack because the rook would like to capture the king, and this rook is protecting by the knight. The knight move like this L shape and protect the rook. So the king moved here on g1, and now white is winning, and I'll provide immediately the solution. One way is to step away with the king to go on d2, and now you can see that one rook is attacking this king, and the other rook doesn't allow the king to move, to go anywhere, and this is a checkmate, as we'll learn a little later. The king is in threat, is attacking, and he doesn't have any legal moves, and for that reason king d2 is a winning move. And we have another winning move here, as we mentioned, the long castling. I'll grab the king, I'll capture the king, I'll put it on c1, I'll leave it, and then I'll capture the rook and put it on d1, and this is a checkmate by the king's move. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. It's very important to remember everything, and I suggest you to repeat this lesson 1 or 2 times again in order to understand everything very clearly, because we learn a lot of rules. And I see you in the next lesson.